right. Part 3 of Balance of World Order, the outsourcing of our lives. Now, obviously, this may seem irrelevant because everybody's focused on Biden and his summit press conference, but I absolutely believe that this current incompetency and the terror we're facing with Biden and Trump is actually due to reproductive politics because, everything has been sort of gerrymandered and rigged, and we don't have a say in most of the time we make in our life. So, obviously, you can see I'm doing more research on this book. I've been wanting to read it a second time on Kindle, amongst others. I probably should be hitting up my Kindle for books I've been planning on getting to. But as this research will explain, it's hard to make time for things and generally live in our hectic schedules as generations are punished for ambiguous reasons, more or less speculation on my part. As someone with no kids, I recognize the importance of time management, the self care of cleaning the house, feeding the pets, sweeping the outside, balancing all this between sleeping and eating on a strict schedule before work. I honestly have it, quote, easier than some raising a family. I'm not saying it makes me better or worse to or not to raise a child. But the lack of certain lifestyles doesn't prevent me from understanding the magnitude on what's happening to the community, on our own labor at home, child rearing, etc. Feminists fought for shorter work days, maternal/paternal leave, daycare at work, and ability to take care of dependents, the elderly, disabled, children, etc. But neoliberal market greed and the desperate projection, see the myth of family, geriatric society with womb envy hampered these feminist principles, ultimately crushing any hope for the working class in the long run. After reading this book, just like The Birth Earth, it instilled a form of urgency in me. So, yeah, there's a couple books like that really like change my perspective on things. And my husband has always tried to say these things to me, and I've always been like, nah, that can't be right. That can't be true. Now, this was when I was in my early 20s, and I was just flat out denying like rape culture and all these crazy things, honestly. Like, I thought I was pretty lucky to be in poverty at a certain point in my life because I had a flat screen TV and all that, but that's obviously bullshit. People shouldn't have to fucking think like that. Anyways, personally, as a dishwasher, which isn't all you do, you gotta clean the stovetops, bathrooms, etc. Aside from seemingly banal feminist principles, taking that low skill labor home was motivated in me by a couple things actually. One, realizing that there will always be something to do, something to clean, gather, etc. Non industrial society requires tasks. Even outside the work concept, there is a goal. But this world we live in now is filthy and polluted, unlike our hunter gatherer path. Not saying it's our path now, but for certain humans it is. Alright, so two, being against agendas like nannygate and outsourced labor instead of doing the labor ourselves. A racial bent to do the dirty, thankless jobs while the rich lay in leisure, which, you know, anybody who is an American should be able to do this and not feel like it's thankless and that, it's not good for the community. Now, obviously, this isn't like what people dreamed of when they thought of the American dream. Nobody really wants to clean. This isn't my point at all. I'm just saying these things will always happen, and in the background, you you should thank them. All right. 3. Despite every industrial checkpoint throughout history altering family and society for better or worse, people always falling through the cracks while others adapt. But the automation and digital workers, humanoid robots that are programmed by elites that see the workers' revolution but sell us the neoliberal version instead, is what freaks me out. Uh, 4. When I was younger, I definitely remembered my mom working all the time, pretty much doing everything, saying she always wanted me to be happy. Wasn't super strict, but would bring me to the hospital if I needed. There was, and still is, a lot of rushing around. We wanted to take care of dependents, but now dependent on government crumbs. So, 5. So I've been criticized for not doing something else to make more money by by other coworkers. And maybe it sounds naive and silly of me, but I say someone has to do it. I don't really know what to say to that aside from just telling them that this is the only job that I can actually like maintain at the moment, which obviously doesn't mean in any way that dishwashing, uh, taking out the trash, cleaning the house, etc. is fun, but it became direly needed in our world. So these things all potentially de-incentivize us to keep going because they find ways around providing for the working class. Unfortunately, it's not a time to give up or risk being ground down. The rest of these articles are concepts related to the books, such as outsourced reproductive labor, home care work being recognized as important as our schedules are more swamped than ever, and the subprime mortgage collapse blamed on black and Latin family Americans who end up losing their homes. This book is really an explanation of our democracy being torn down, starting with family, child rearing, the housing market being demographically firebombed. Also written before COVID and the overturning of Roe, the attitude was surely looming and exactly the same, as in Ronald Reagan and Nixon's welfare queens and the quote breeding machines rhetoric being the same as Roe being removed for demographic national security. So, I'm going to get to this article now. In How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, From Welfare Reform to Foreclosure to Trump, Laura Briggs chronicles how we arrived at this time/wages reproductive labor crisis. Page 11. How she asks, did it get so hard to perform the labor necessary to produce human life while also earning the wages it takes to keep us all alive? Never mind thriving. Since the late 1970s, a massive neoliberal shift has realigned the relationship between government, business, and households in the United States. The shocks and disruptions wrought by this shift have transformed everyday life, stagnated real wages, have sent nearly every available adult into the labor force. Longer work hours have eroded the time left for essential care work, and reduced government support have privatized dependency, devolving responsibility for the well-being of children, elders, and whole communities onto individuals. Massive disinvestment in families and communities have undermined our ability to bear and raise children, feed people, care for the sick, elderly, and those who cannot work, create safe communities, build kin relationships, and attend to people's physical and psychic well-being. In How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, From Welfare Reform to Foreclosure to Trump, Laura Briggs chronicles how we arrived at this, uh, oh, favoring empirics over uh, abstraction. Sorry, there's a crack on my tablet for some reason. Briggs sets out to answer this question by examining neoliberal from within families and households. Quote, where we have most acutely felt the changes of neoliberalism, page 14, and, quote, lived out our immersion, page 190. Each chapter is grounded in an issue that has animated political debate in the U.S. over the last half century: feminism and black feminism movement, welfare reform, migrant care work, infertility and infant mortality, gay marriage, and predatory lending. A disparate list at first glance. These issues are, for Briggs, organized along a single political economic fault line: the growing and seemingly irreconcilable tension between productive and reproductive labor, or put it otherwise, between our capacity to work for wages and provide care for free. Briggs' orientation toward the household and the family places her book within The long feminist tradition that has grappled with large scale economic changes by observing them at work in everyday life, in how we feed, clothe, house, teach, comfort, care for, and love ourselves and others. She is, in effect, turning a classic feminist slogan inside out. For Briggs, the political is personal. What happens in public policy is deeply informed by what happens in our households. With each chapter, analytical turn, and personal anecdote, Briggs illustrates the deep implication of home and economy challenging long-standing and persistent efforts to construct these spheres as dichotomies. We are schooled, Briggs writes, to think of the home and the economy in straightforward binary opposition, the former belonging to the private sphere, and latter to the public one, also the realm of politics. And yet, the major questions that have dominated political and economic debate in the U.S. since the 1970s have households and families at their core. From same-sex marriage to immigration to the foreclosure crisis, economic restructuring turns on and often operates through a thoroughly reproductive politics. Deeply gendered, most reproductive labor is still performed by people understood to be women. This politics is also deeply racialized. For decades, the race-based denigration of reproductive labor has been a key piece of conservative strategies to increase private profits and shrink public expenditures. In the 1980s and 1990s, government conservatives transmuted accounts of black welfare queens, Latina breeding machines, and sexually promiscuous single mothers into a powerful justification for the withdrawal of state support from undeserving families and communities. A decade later, in the early 2000s, bankers targeted black and Latino borrowers, women in particular, for high-risk, high-interest, high-profit mortgages in a practice known as reverse redlining. Subprime, the industry's term for a predatory loan, became a gendered and racialized demographic category as much as the financial definition. Systematically dispossessed across generations, subprime borrowers were among those hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis that followed. Today, the castigation of black, Latinx, indigenous, and immigrant women's reproductive behaviors continue to apace. Structural inequalities in health, wealth, and access to care, including disproportionately high rates of infertility, infant mortality, poverty, and premature death, are individualized, blamed on women of color's reproductive choices. The massive political economic changes wrought by neoliberalism, Briggs argues, were enacted, at least in part, in and through these and other racialized stories of dependency, irresponsibility, and immorality. The reproductive labor is thus doubly reproductive under neoliberal capitalism. First, as has been well established by Marxist feminists like Maria Mies, 1986, and Sylvia Federici, 1998, the free and undervalued labor provided in the home by people understood to be women is essential to the reproduction of political profits, not least, though not only, because it is required for the reproduction of the laborer, and second, as explored by Briggs in the text under consideration here, the demonization of reproductive labor, particularly that performed by women of color, has legitimized the withdrawal of state support from costly social welfare institutions, thereby catalyzing private capital accumulation. Briggs' focus on the post-1970s period is timely and crucial. Recent events in the U.S. have shown into sharp relief the centrality of racism and social and economic policy. Her analysis illuminates striking evidence of continuities between the politics that brought Trump to Washington and the 4 decades of social and economic restructuring that preceded his election. But the reproduction race economics triumvirate at the heart of her text finds purchase in older histories as well, like the economic and political reforms under consideration in her book. The American eugenics movement, at its peak in the opening decades of the 20th century, united sexist, racist, ableist, and classist practices into a broad network of institutions that affected the everyday lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The pervasive cultural myths that used to justify and enact neoliberal restructuring, that immigrants are to blame for white workers, people's poverty, that that traditional family values must be protected at all costs, that women of color's moral failings are responsible for the ills of their communities and for those of the nation, are contiguous with the eugenics era narratives of reproductive fitness. Then, as as now, policies and laws on immigration, incarceration, marriage, education, and access to housing and healthcare were shot with concerns about proper reproduction at multiple scales. The family, the household, the economy, the nation attempts to discipline the reproductive behavior of race, class, disabled others, modeled on whites' domination of slave women's wombs, Roberts, 1998, were tethered to concern about the economic health of the nation. Immigration bans and forced sterilization were justified by recourse to a narrative of social and economic improvement for a nation state to better its position relative to other nation states. Its people had to be healthy, variously skilled, and mentally competent. McWhorter, 2009. As late as 1970s, the Office of Economic Development, under the direction of Donald Rumsfeld, was recommending sterilization in cases of mental defect. Stern, 2016. This very brief foray into the history of American eugenics isn't intended as a corrective to Briggs' temporal framing. Rather, it's to evince the enduring persistence of her organizing thesis that reproduction of children, but also all life and community more broadly, sits at the heart of U.S. politics. Questions of who gets to reproduce, with whom, how, and under what conditions have long saturated social and economic policy in multiple, if at times contradictory ways, and with material effects in everyday life, and they continue to do so. The politics of reproduction is thus, quote, key to understanding our shared political life in the United States. Page 209. Throughout the book, Briggs urges us to remember that the feminist, labor, racial justice movements that presaged our contemporary political movement, quote, they were all about reproductive politics, she writes, imagining a just society that would see children fed, fighting to limit the overreach of business and the long workday, trying to halt the involuntary sterilization and sexual assault, and ensuring communities, families, and households had the resources to raise healthy children and care for others who could not work. Page 30. Her account of these movements provided an important record of the past, of the fights for survival that, quote, came before, page 22, the turn to neoliberalism. But her desire to reactivate this history is also acutely futures oriented. In these movements, in the Black Panthers' free breakfast program for children, in calls for wages for housework and 40-hour work week, in fights against forced sterilization and for free child care, Briggs finds concrete plans for revolution and reproductive policies. She concludes her book with a list of suggestions for how we might bring about such a revolution, many of which recall the demands of mid-20th century activists. Paid parental leave, quote, food stamps that don't require a waiting day in line, page 211, and free high-quality preschool, to list a few examples. Acknowledging that these fixes may seem out of reach in the climate or racial division that brought Trump to the White House. Briggs maintains that we can't understand his rise to power or combat the forces he represents without them. Her ending is thus a call to action, a call to the opposite, a call to oppose neoliberalism and exploitation by renewing the fight for social support for families, households, and communities. So we aren't even there yet. Biden in his term just allowed Roe to stay overturned. Didn't really do anything to fight that. Just sort of said you need to put seats, uh, you need to give Democrats seats, and they'll vote for the right to have your bodies again. And he was cracking down on like protesters when there was like a genocide happening. So it really is like, how can you vote for this guy and see him as that great and moral and like there for you? Now Trump is no better. Trump is slightly worse, but like allowing Biden to do what he's doing, honestly, it's just red carpeting conservatives. And obviously, like, Democrats don't want Biden out there, but and that's why I don't see this necessarily as like a scheme of Democrats, just a wedge issue by getting Trump in office. So I think I've heard that before, and I don't believe it. I think that's a pretty big conspiracy theory, but the incompetence is definitely the red carpet for the conservative fascist wing. Now, like it's you can barely touch the atrocity and what Biden has allowed during his time. Like, it's unthinkable what he's allowed. And with what Trump is going to do, you know, it's bad. It might be worse, but we're not talking about, like, who are you going to vote for, Trump or Biden? It's beyond that. We're potentially screwed. Alright. So, I watched other people cover the press conference at the NATO summit, but yeah. Alright, so seizing the means of production. Unrecognized, unpaid, and yet utterly necessary reproductive labor is everywhere in our lives. Can it form the basis for a renewed radical politics? Sorry about that. Okay, so this might reiterate a few things that I've been saying already. Hopefully not, but I really just wanted to read these anyways. In the 1970s, feminists demanded that their governments pay them for wages for housework. So honestly, that sounds kind of, I don't know. It is really important, especially when we have no time to do anything and our schedules are swamping us. So is it reasonable when your schedule at work is so insane and you actually don't have time to do anything at home? Now, people say we'll just make time. Yeah, I mean, sure. That doesn't really help. Yeah, I'm 50-50 about this paying people for housework, but I can see where they're coming from. Beginning with the International Feminist Collective in Italy in 1972, the wages for housework movement spread across the globe. Their demands for compensation issued from a larger political ambition to abolish gender inequality by eliminating the distinction between work done in the home and work done in the marketplace. Quote, wages for housework for all women, the New York Wages for the Housework Committee argued, means the power to refuse the double shift of the second job, which is now our only alternative to working for nothing. End quote. At the core of the wages for housework movement was the concept of reproductive labor. Simply put, the reproductive labor is the work required to sustain human life and raise future generations. The concept comes from Marx, who distinguished the reproductive labor of the factory from the unpaid work that reproduces labor power. For capitalism to survive, workers must be nourished from one workday to the next, and future generations of workers must be born and raised. Cooking or preparing food, cleaning and maintaining the home, caring for the elderly or the sick, and raising and looking after children are all forms of labor that make possible the flow of generations. Historically, that work has been performed by women. Reproductive labor is like electricity, invisible yet everywhere, and it powers everything. Much of the negotiation of daily life involves deciding whether to give your time and energy to performing reproductive labor or outsourcing it to somebody else. It is unrecognized, uncelebrated, often unpaid, and yet utterly necessary. It is yet certainly a part of our everyday political lexicon, but look closely into any major political issue today, and you will likely find a struggle over reproductive labor. This is how provocation of Laura Brooks' book, How All Politics Became a Reproductive Politics. It is a history of neoliberalism, told from the vantage point of the family. The chronology is a familiar one. In the late 1970s, the U.S. government moved to address inflation by tightening the money supply, dismantling the social safety net, and weakening the bargaining power of unions. Confronted with a double blow of stagnation of real wages and fewer resources of public support of reproductive labor, most households could not sustain themselves on a single income. Meanwhile, conservatives justified the shrinking of public programs by denigrating black families and uh, fulminating against welfare queens. In reality, white women and children were the biggest beneficiaries of welfare. And if you read my book review of eugenics, a short introduction, uh, welfare was initially just for white people, if we're talking about America. And once it became more politically known and used as propaganda that black people and such were using it, you know, it went against the demographic strategy. Again, this is why our country is in such shambles, because now it's just like the geriatric empire only sees it fit to have an old man as president and to fight the fascists with the fascists, essentially. All of this has shifted responsibility for reproductive labor from the public sphere onto the shoulders of private individuals and families. The dual income nuclear family has become the site of all dependency. Those who don't fit into that family model are deemed immoral. Those who do face ever increasing burdens of reproductive labor. This turn, this this turn in reproductive politics has led to what Briggs calls offshoring reproduction. Families, under increased financial pressure, must pay others to do reproductive labor. The work of social reproduction is pushed further and further down the social hierarchy, onto employed women taking up a second shift at home, and then onto nannies and house cleaners. Many of these domestic workers are immigrants made available as labor through the devastating effects of structural adjustment policies in their home countries, aka the IMF putting them in debt and making them their bitch. Okay, and middle class American families can afford to hire them because their legal vulnerability keeps their wages low. The relationship stretches abroad as those traveling workers must then bear the expense of leaving their children with other caregivers at home, often in Central America or the Philippines. By labeling this process offshoring reproduction, Briggs makes visible the relationship between the wealthy, white, career woman and those who care for their nanny's children. The conditions in which women become pregnant and give birth have become more precarious. Briggs considers two kinds of infertility. The first is caused by economic demands. Women in competitive, high-paying careers delay childbirth until they are professionally financially secure, but less likely to become pregnant without assistance from expensive reproductive technologies with high failure rates, such as in vitro fertilization. Even to this day, I think this is true, last I read. The second kind of infertility is caused by structural racism in the workplace, in the housing market, and crucially in the medical establishment. Infertility is one outcome of systemic assault on the reproductive lives of black women, the consequences of which are evident in the statistics. Compared to white women, black women are more then twice as likely to have their infants die, more than 3 times as likely to die in childbirth, and twice as likely to struggle to become pregnant. Briggs does not claim that these two kinds of infertility are equivalent. As she points out, making IVF available to affluent white women while pathologizing and neglecting black pregnancy constitutes de facto eugenics. Okay, true actually, very much so. Her argument is that, in both cases, we should define infertility not as an individual medical program, but as the condition with economic and social determinants. To address infertility, we must address sexism and racism. So, in another book I read about uh, black infant mortality, it was actually talking about how most black women, I think African Americans, usually have premature children. And for the most part, this isn't just some natural thing that happens. I believe this is not. There's some people in the narrative that say it's tied to the neglect of slavery. So, comment in the uh, comment down below if you think that's possible, or you think that there's more current issues at play, or you think it just stacks. I think it's possible it just stacks, but it's also possible there's other issues at hand that are just doing that, like lead and just like how everything is just kind of less healthy these days, especially with the no regulations anymore. God knows what the fuck's gonna happen to our food. Okay, it's not a stretch to see childcare, fertility, and maternal health as reproductive politics, but the capacious political potential of the argument comes from when Brooks looks further afield. She argues that the court decision legalizing gay marriage was based not on freedom of equality, but on the principle that responsibility for children, the sick, and the elderly should fall to private families rather than the state. Expanding the legal definition of marriage perpetrates this economic arrangement. Mass incarceration has separated millions of children from their parents, causing immeasurable psychological damage as well as removing countless hours of care and reproductive labor from households. A high proportion of those who had their homes foreclosed in 2008 financial meltdown were single women, female heads of households, and women of color who had been targeted by predatory subprime loans. In all these cases, the state abdicates responsibility, and individual families and communities must take on more work, more debt, and more risk. Quote, "There's no outside to reproductive politics," Briggs argues. Perusing the mainstream news media outlets provides ample evidence in support of this claim. A recent move by the Department of Education to deregulate the student loan debt collection industry comes at a time when parents increasingly bear the cost of educating their children, and young adults are saddled with debt at an age when they might consider starting their own families. Trump's overturning of federal flood risk management standards for housing construction makes families, rather than the state, responsible for the health and financial risk associated with the rising sea levels. Marco Rubio's proposal that women access maternity leave by drawing down their Social Security benefits relieves none of the financial costs of bearing children, entrenching a social arrangement in which individual women rather than the public are responsible for social reproduction. These struggles might all be framed as a battle over who should do and pay for the reproductive labor of caring for people at all life stages and raising future generations. One could go on through the headlines in this manner, and at this point, by focusing on reproduction, Briggs shows that privatization and increasing wealth inequality are as much about gender as they are about class. What Briggs is offering is not a comprehensive account of reproductive politics, but rather a framework for reinterpreting all politics. Perhaps we can define all politics as reproductive politics, but should we? A basic political platform along these lines might demand policies that offer material support for reproductive labor and reject policies that shift these burdens onto private individuals and families. One benefit of such a politics is that it is universal. Everybody either performs reproductive labor or relies on someone else. Equally important, a politics defined in terms of reproductive labor justifies a reproductive redistribution of resources that accounts not only for wealth inequality but also for the material effects of racism and sexism. As Briggs makes clear, those who historically have taken on the most unrecognized reproductive labor are the poor and especially women of color. To call for the politics in which reproductive labor is more equitably performed and remunerated is to call for material redistribution along lines of class, gender, and race. To expand what counts as work is to radically reconfigure whose work is valued, and to begin to dismantle the perceived stalemate between class politics and identity politics, which unfortunately we're seeing a lot of the the fake leftism sort of take the identity politics to just vote corporate Democrat, and we're seeing that, which is using identity politics to not really benefit them in the long run. Though, if you truly believe that there was going to be like transgender camps and gay camps when Trump becomes president, which, I'd be killed off too because of that, but I just don't believe that's going to happen. I could be wrong. I do think it's going to be standard bullshit from Trump, maybe a little worse. I unfortunately think I have a lot to worry, honestly, with Trump, but talking about Biden like he's better for you, like, that is crazy. Okay. What about the rest of the world? Briggs keeps her analysis within U.S. borders, yet the United States is implicated in the reproductive lives of individuals and families far beyond its borders. The Mexico City policy, or the global gag rule, is reinstated every time the American public votes a Republican president into office, curtailing the provision of life-saving maternal and child health services to women around the world. And the U.S. government is not the only American entity that gets an outside say in global reproductive politics. Private American citizens and the philanthropists increasingly have the power to direct health and educational resources around the world and set the public agendas without being accountable to an electorate. Melinda Gates may help to save lives by making contraceptives available to women in developing nations, but her argument that birth control will lift individual women around the world out of poverty ignores the ways American environmental and trade policies, not to mention war making, shape the reproductive lives and well-being of women across the global south. Absolutely true. Now, I think if you go to my Myth of Family Part 1, I actually point this out, that you can't just contracept and do population control to remove the crises of a population. Now, say if everybody was on fire or starving and you just sterilize half the population, everybody's still on fire and starving. You didn't solve any of the problems, but you made the people with the problems smaller. And this is the issue with thinking of contraception and abortion as just a fix-all thing. Now, women in the U.S. are severely put into the positions to need abortion and contraception, unless they're just using it for acne or something. So, yeah, conservatives will outlaw abortion and put you into the position of rape or something, or a Democrat, but most likely Republicans seem to uh, they really ferment these dynamics, I think. Like Jim Bopp, when he was justifying that 10-year-old that and being a lawyer, justifying rape like that. So, yeah, it's my basic point around that is that uh, as much as you do need contraceptions and abortion sometimes, you are forced into the position to need one because of the neglect and the lack of justice that some women face. Because cops will just sit on evidence of semen for fucking like weeks, and it'll just, it's not viable at that point. So we do live in a rape culture, guys. All right, Briggs knows all of this. She has examined reproductive politics on a global scale in her earlier work. Her decision to restrict her focus to the United States in this book reflects a choice to address these issues in the realm of electoral politics, with American citizens making demands of a government that is accountable to them. But if, as Briggs argues, racism is what motivated electoral support for neoliberal policies in the 1980s, what makes a progressive, inclusive, redistributive reproductive politics politically possible now? In a way, Briggs suggests an answer with the structure of her book. Each chapter brings together constituencies differentiated along lines of class, race, immigration, status, and sexual orientation by illuminating how they are connected in a more universal reproductive politics. Will the more privileged members of these groups see it in that way? I am reminded of a brilliant sign from the 2017 Women's March that posed the challenge. Quote, "See all you nice white ladies at the next BLM march, right?" In a moment of optimism, the sign pithily conjured a history of exclusions within American feminist movements. As feminists of color have long observed, feminists have been claimed to be universal, have often presumed their subjects to be white, straight, healthy, safe, middle class, politically enfranchised, and able bodied. The Women's March was about a number of issues, reproductive freedom among them, and nothing could be more of an assault on reproduction than the threat of state-sanctioned violence against the children that black mothers bear and raise. Can we turn these connections into coalitions? No single book can answer that question, but Briggs has shown that we must ask it. I actually have something that I wanted to add here. Now, when it comes to women working and the Fourth Industrial Revolution by Carl Schwab, it actually asks the question, who will be harmed the most when automation is fully churning? Will it harm men the most? Because most of the heavy lifting and the dangerous jobs are being done by machines anyways, but it also points out that the system gave women jobs and it has always been patriarchally framed, and so women might be harmed by the most because of their privilege, which they never had initially, being taken away. Well, anyways, I'll see you in the next one.